Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our panel discussion today on tackling induced seismicity risk with data and standardization. My name is Heather DeShon, and I am a seismologist and professor of earth sciences at Southern Methodist University, and I will be serving as the moderator. Today, we are interested in identifying the paths forward to mitigate risk due to induced earthquakes. We're going to discuss what are the challenges, what are the successes, and how do we make progress on this issue. The technical sessions that preceded our panel nicely highlighted the cutting-edge research using regional fault mapping with potential field data, using DAS technology and new instrumentation, and also discuss the large data sets that result. We're also happy to have the last speaker in the session, Ryan Schultz, join us to discuss traffic light laws and probabilistic seismic hazard and risk assessment. So this panel is going to continue that conversation that you hopefully saw earlier this afternoon. And we're going to provide the audience a chance to participate. So please, as you're listening, prepare your questions, place them in the chat, and we will open up the panel discussion to the audience a little bit later. But for now, we have convened a truly impressive set of panelists that span industry, government, and academic settings. And I'd like to take the opportunity to allow them to introduce themselves. So Anne, we'll start with you.
Thanks so much, Heather. And thanks for everyone for joining this session. My name is Anne Robertson-Tait. I'm a geologist. I've been working in the geothermal sector and the commercial side mainly for more than 35 years, and including on EGS projects. And I was sorry to leave Ryan's presentation a little early to get into the green room for this session, but I'll be glad to participate in the discussion overall. So thanks.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Heather. My name is Elizabeth Cochran. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey, the Earthquake Science Center there. So I've been an observational seismologist for a couple of decades, but I've spent the last decades working to understand earthquakes induced by disposal of fluids in the subsurface, and that's primarily related to oil and gas production. So looking at earthquakes in the central US and working to understand how earthquakes are triggered by the introduction or removal of fluids into the subsurface. So I think there are some lessons we can take from oil and gas related induced seismicity and apply to geothermal problems. So I'm excited to talk about that today.
Thank you. Alexandros?
Thank you, Heather. My name is Alexandros. I'm a seismologist. I'm a research scientist at the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm the principal investigator of the Texas Seismological Network and seismology research funded by the state of Texas. My background is mostly earthquake hazard and seismicity monitoring. The last 6 years, I've been working for University of Texas at Austin on induced seismicity due to human activity. Mostly it is oil and gas. The last couple of years, I've been involved in a couple of geothermal projects as well.
Great. And Ryan?
Yes, so I worked at the Alberta Geological Survey for almost a decade, setting up their network Raven, so we could monitor earthquakes, building catalogs in that, identifying cases of induced seismicity, and then trying to understand essentially where and why they occurred. This was dominantly related to fracking, but there was also some petroleum fracking, I guess I should say, and also disposal and some production related cases. But since then, I've decided to go back and do a PhD. So right now I'm at Stanford, just trying to wrap that up, building tools there to try and better understand how risk can be incorporated into managing induced seismicity.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we're going to start our conversation today with a question to Anne. So Anne, you co-authored the 2012 report Protocol for Addressing Induced Seismicity Associated with Geothermal Systems. Based on the last decade of research since that document was published, there's been a real expansion in geothermal and funding for geothermal research from the US government. What could or should be revised in these protocols based on this last 10 years?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Heather. And I think there's two things. Well, the protocol that I was involved in was mainly authored by seismologists, and there was a vibrations expert there, focusing not so much on magnitude, but in fact, ground shaking and how hazardous that might or might not be. But I would say that since then, it seems that there's been more of a focus instead of on probabilistic seismic hazard assessment, there's becoming more and more of a focus on physical models that sort of are built from the ground up and assessing them as well, not instead of probabilistic models, but as well as probabilistic models. And I think this is important, even though, and the previous presentations were pretty informative in terms of identifying faults and mapping them and understanding them in various ways. But there's, I think, a little bit more to it than that. And I think the physical models that are starting to be built more, even if they're relatively simple, should be compared, in terms of their results to the probabilistic analyses. And the other element, and Pohang is a very good example of this in a very negative way, deliberately injecting into a fault that is known to exist and known to be active. One of the first tenets of the protocol is don't inject into faults, particularly active ones. And I think the age of activity on faults is another element of those physical models. And I'm speaking as a geologist, not a seismologist. I'd like to see those physical models become more prevalent, and so that they're very location specific, which I think induced seismicity has the tendency to be. It's relying on whatever structures exist and their likelihood of moving and their state of stress and when they will become critically stressed or what it will take. So those kinds of elements, I think, would be a welcome addition to any protocol. And perhaps the other panelists have a comment about that too.
Yes, I should say that I'm going to send each of you a question, but if any of the panelists have opinions or thoughts on the question to the previous panelists, you're free to step in and speak up.
Makes it interesting.
It does. We're here to have a conversation. Go ahead, Alexandros.
Yeah, I can add a couple of things. I agree with Anne. I think it's a nice opportunity that we see recently some publications with physics-based models. I think that is very important. It will help us a lot to be proactive because those models can be used even for height casting the seismicity, depending on the operation information. The other thing I would like to add is, and Anne mentioned that a bit, is that it is important to have a very detailed site characterization, because eventually where we come into identifying the seismicity, active or non-active faults that can be reactivated, it is to site characterization. That is something we should take time and make sure that this is complete, so we can minimize any risk due to induced seismicity.
And I'll just comment back that there will always be unknowns. I mean, we can't know the subsurface as well as we would like to. And so I do think the probabilistic models also have real validity. I'm not trying to denigrate them in any way. I just feel like it's better to have both, even if the physics-based model is somewhat rough or simplistic or tenuous based on available data at any given site.
Great. Now, Elizabeth, I'm going to go ahead and ask you the next question, because I think it's very much related to the conversation Alexandros and Anne were just having. So over the course of your career, you've made significant strides in understanding triggering of earthquakes due to natural perturbations like tides, and you've done quite a bit of research on anthropogenic subsurface modifications to the stress field, right, in oil and gas induced earthquakes and now in geothermal. What are some of the key data and instrumentation needs that you see And over what time scale do you think we need to collect this data or continue monitoring to mitigate risks from induced earthquakes, particularly in the geothermal sector?
Yeah, and that's a pretty large question because there's a lot of different data that we probably need to apply to the problem in order to get a handle on the induced seismicity risk or hazard. And so, a lot of, I guess I want to start with a piece, which is we really need data both before production starts to really understand what the baseline is at a particular site. And also, generally, the more data that is widely available for researchers and scientists to use to explore the relationship between the injection and production and any induced seismicity, having those data widely available is extremely important. So let's get into the data. So key piece of information, we're primarily interested in things like pressurization rates. So things like high sample rate, injection, and production data at geothermal fields is incredibly important. So what we found is that rapid changes in the pressures tend to be what causes earthquakes to happen. And so, we in the oil and gas related induced seismicity have seen that information be available initially kind of monthly. So we get one data point for a given month of injection, and that's really not the level of detail we need. We sort of need daily or even hourly information. And then, of course, we want really good control on the seismology. So are there earthquakes happening? What are their magnitudes? We tend to think of hazard as being earthquakes that cause perhaps damaging ground shaking or even ground shaking that's felt. But in order to properly understand when we might get those events, we need to know when the little earthquakes are happening and really monitor those. And then, of course, at geothermal, which is a little different from, say, oil and gas related seismicity, surface deformation becomes really important. So we can get that from GPS measurements, from INSAR. And the reason that's important is you can actually get a handle on kind of where fluid is going within the reservoir and maybe where you're depleting certain areas of your geothermal reservoir or where there's barriers to flow. And then going back to what Anne was saying, all of that detailed geologic information so we can make those more detailed physical models. So where are the faults? Where are the flow pathways? Some of those can be mapped through seismicity if it's happening. Some of that's mapped through surface deformation, and then things like pore pressure, subsurface pore pressure measurements, so we actually know where those fluid is going. So that's, I guess, quite a long answer, but hopefully it gets the conversation started.
I'll just say that that's really important in EGS projects. You mentioned ground deformation, and this is something we've realized there's sometimes some aseismic or maybe undetectable, perhaps by the system, seismicity that's happening. And discriminating the active volume from the seismically the hydraulically versus seismically active volumes is really, really important. So I was really glad you mentioned that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've seen in cases such as in the Salton Sea where there can be triggered aseismic slip on some nearby faults that then leads to subsequent seismicity. And so knowing that basically silent slip is happening, we only know that from the surface deformation.
Do any other panelists have some thoughts on what Elizabeth rightly said is a very big question? Not only what data and instrumentation, but also what timescale monitoring needs to occur over.
The only piece I would add to that maybe is making sure that this data always ends up being open and publicly accessible. In a lot of cases, at least the experience with oil and gas industry is these data sets are available, but they're typically not always shared. And these things have tremendous ability to start answering some of these questions. So having that sort of open access to it where anyone can answer any questions that maybe industry or operators aren't thinking about, that they just don't have the skill set or the time to look at. Other crowds like government or academics would be very interested to answer a lot of these questions.
And the public, I think, would be very interested to be having access to this information. And one of the things that I was working on the protocol was public outreach and being very transparent with the public, which in several EGS projects that I've been involved in, we've done that very deliberately. And I think that's another element, not only the folks who think hard and long about seismicity from a technical perspective, but also the ones who may experience it.
Yeah, well, maybe to build on that, it loops into that transparency, because if you have other groups other than just the operator saying the same thing, then it builds that trust and that credibility, so the public can actually believe essentially what's being said.
Agree.
So that's a great jumping off point to talk to Alexandros a bit about his experiences as the director of the TexNet Seismic Network. So Alexandros, the Texas Seismic Network was deployed to monitor seismicity, right, in Texas, both natural and induced, in order to provide improved hazard characterization and risk assessment. You're now providing the authoritative earthquake locations for TexNet for the United States National Earthquake Catalog. But this experience has placed TexNet and your research group at the BEG, right, at the nexus of needing to incorporate and provide real-time seismicity monitoring using public data, but also accessing industry data, and simultaneously conducting research on hazard and risk. So based on your experiences in this realm, what are your thoughts on the role of communication and state and federal monitoring as it pertains to geothermal development? And what do you think has worked for the state of Texas and for TexNet under the current models that you're using to kind of work in this realm where state government and academic interests and industry interests intersect?
Thank you, Heather. That's really a good question. So I'll start with the first one related to the communication and between the state and the federal agencies. We have a very nice collaboration with USGS about not only deploying stations and monitoring the seismicity, but also adding more different type of instruments like doing pore pressure measurements in the state in order to understand hopefully the level of pore pressure change that might affect the seismicity or activate the existing faults, reactivate existing faults. So that is I think it's a good way of collaborating between state and federal agencies. We have also been working with the industry. We managed to have access to some of the private array data, and we hopefully are providing through our websites and our publications relocated catalogs that help the public and the research community to understand the seismicity. Those are, I think, good points for moving forward with geothermal as well. And now for the geothermal project, we have here, we partner with private industry, it was, I have to say, we're lucky to say that from the beginning, they said that the data will be open. So that means that all the ground motion data recorded real time in 2 sites in South Texas, they are available through our web services, FDSN web services, and you can just go and grab them and do your analysis. For one project, we do background seismicity checking now, and the other we have been some testing of the geothermal production. And if anyone has interest, I can provide the period that this testing did run, so you can go and back and check the seismicity yourself for that. I think one of the most important challenges concerning the instrumentation that we've been facing is the needs that are related to somehow the high temperature of the instrumentation that are necessary in our case. That is, we need to go to deploy seismic stations close to the geothermal production, and that means that we have to make instruments that are low high temperature. Our limits are mostly 200 C. That is pretty high compared to what we see nowadays for broadband sensor. Of course, there are other issues with the instrumentation like signal to noise ratio, but this we try to solve these problems with signal processing and array techniques. Now, moving to the earthquake hazard and risk, I think the key parameter, and I think we mentioned that also during our discussion, is to be proactive. That means do a good site characterization or record baseline seismicity. Those are the two key parameters for me that can help any investment, so you don't you minimize the risk of your investment for a geothermal project.
Thank you. Do any of the other panelists have some thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I'll just add from sort of the federal government perspective. So a lot of times there's, with the U.S. Geological Survey, we do monitor seismicity across the United States. However, as Alexandros knows quite well, and Heather, the distribution of stations that we have is not sufficient to do kind of the high level of monitoring that's needed at an individual geothermal site. So sometimes there's an assumption that, well, there's already a catalog of earthquakes that the U.S. Geological Survey puts out, so we could just use that to monitor the geothermal plant. And so, in California, where we have some of our densest station distributions, we can see, we can reliably get magnitude 2 and larger earthquakes across the state. But for really understanding induced seismicity, you want to get quite a bit smaller than that, and that requires local stations. So for example, Alexandros said that they've worked hard to ensure that, there's data available close to where operations are happening. And that's a really key part of it. And that can be done in collaboration with the states and in collaboration with the industry itself.
And I'll just make a comment about that. Having collaborated a lot with Lawrence Berkeley Lab on monitoring induced seismicity in EGS projects, the challenge of temperature and long-term deployment at depth is a really key factor. And so I'll just make a pitch that we continue to try to develop these. And I think there actually are some geophones that operate at fairly high temperatures for decent periods of time. But there's always a compromise in EGS projects between depth, temperature, and number of observation holes in which to deploy seismometers, the geology, and what rock type will provide the rest signal and all that. It's a big discussion before any EGS project kicks off. People really try to optimize as best they can, given the limitation that they might be faced with in terms of monitoring right at the zone that you're stimulating. And this is where the most important information is. And I will just concur with you that, events of lower magnitudes give a lot of understanding and hopefully aren't mostly felt by people. And yet, the fundamentals of EGS is small events will be created. We know that, and we use them to our advantage to understand how to manipulate the rock. And I think that research agenda to grow EGS, to make it a reality across the United States and other places is a really important one. So we have to sort of figure out a good way to work with the public and make sure that they are feeling comfortable and that they buy into this new energy source that can be very effective for our future.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Ryan. Now, Ryan, you've been working on really practical regulatory frameworks to manage induced seismicity in the context of both oil and gas, hydrofracking in particular, and more recently in the geothermal sector. What are some of the key similarities and differences that you've seen between mitigation strategies in these two sectors?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of this can be framed around, so in the previous talk that I gave, one of the most important factors for building these frameworks we found is the concept of trailing seismicity. So more than variations in like site amplification or the ground motion prediction equation or anything like that, the trailing seismicity was the dominant feature. So that's, to first order, the thing that we probably need to focus on. Is building better models to get a sense of what can happen after you turn off the pumps. Because this is important, essentially. You need to apply the brakes a little bit before your actual risk point to make sure that you're not going to hit it. We've started to look at that in a little bit more detail. It seems, at least so far for the data that's available, that this actually, I guess, segues into the previous point. So having more cases to scrutinize this better is obviously helpful, but the cases that we've seen, the data that comes from essentially the frac related cases and the EGS type cases are fairly comparable for what happens after the fact. So in that sense, these, what I'm going to call like these short-term induced seismicity, so that you have some sort of quick project, like either an EGS stimulation or a frac stimulation that goes on for a period of what could be either hours or up to weeks, where they're doing multi-stage. The induced seismicity is essentially just associated with that and then turns off and dies off. So the tools and concepts between these cases, at least for the trailing seismicity part, are essentially directly comparable, or at least so far what the data shows for that. Extending this to other concepts, so like the longer term seismicity type operations where it's either disposal, production, or like geothermal production, that's going to be occurring over a period of decades. Figuring out how to build that for these types of cases is still an ongoing research challenge, essentially, because there's not a lot of cases where these operations have been definitively ended to build up a big database to essentially compare or say anything meaningful for that. So I think that there's direct comparison if you can lump them into these two groups, but that's also a bit of speculation on my point as well.
Thank you. Does any other panelists want to jump in on that particular question?
I'll just say it sort of brings up the need for predictive models that are, I don't know the right word, robust, maybe. And, you know, there are companies that have sort of simulation of stimulation models that I think are useful. But what Ryan mentioned is the long-term continued, you know, micro or real seismicity that might occur in a project as you operate it. And this is a little bit left behind, in my view, in sort of the discussion about induced seismicity. It's more related to the stimulation activity itself rather than the later operations. So I think, you know, predictive models tend to be about simulating a stimulation, but maybe we need to extend them further in a temporal sense. And of course, in geothermal, you have not only hydraulics, but you have temperature differentials and things to consider there. So it's an interesting topic, and I hope that there will be more movement on that.
So I'm going to move on to a word that's in the title for our panel, and that's standardization. As we think about geothermal operations that last decades, collecting data like the USGS has obviously done for years, but like TexNet is also doing, we have to think about how to share that data with each other, right? We have to think about how to make sure that everyone is on the same page, right? In regards to what to collect and how to report it, particularly for in a public situation. So what are the pros and cons, or the utility or challenges of standardization of either data or instrumentation or some sort of traffic light protocol in light of the multiple stakeholders and the variety of the geology in various geothermal operations? So, Anne, I'll let you speak first, but I'd really like to hear everyone's thoughts on that particular question.
Well, I guess the protocol is something of a standard. It's more of a guideline than a rule, let's just say. I don't, pretend to say that it's a rule. However, I agree with the concept that some kind of standard procedures should be in place. And the traffic light system is a very valid one. It doesn't, and it can deal with the trailing seismicity issue, I think, Ryan. It has the potential to do that, and I'm really sorry I missed the last part of your talk. But in any case, it's the standardization process, I think, would give not only the operators confidence that they're not going to cause any real damage, and it would also give the public more confidence that although they might feel induced seismicity more of as a nuisance, which Ryan also mentioned in his presentation, rather than a damage criteria or a damage effect, the nuisance itself could be kind of acknowledged if we had more standardization. And again, bringing it back to the protocol, our vibrations expert was really helpful to assess, what kind of vibrations really are damaging versus ones that would be perceived as a nuisance. So I think somehow the difference between nuisance and damage has to be included in such a standard.
I think I'll maybe touch on some of the stuff that you said about the traffic light, building around that. So there's eventually room to build, I think, standardization, or let's call it maybe best practices. But I feel like a lot of what's important, or the magic in that, is what happens in your yellow light procedure. So you're doing your mitigation strategies to ensure that things aren't growing. Ideally, you would stay in green or the yellow light territory and never have to bump into a red. But I don't feel like there's at least enough evidence to confidently point out, for a given scenario, for what we know about the in situ stress or the faults that are there, and then how you're going to operate in these regimes, what are the correct knobs and dials that you can turn or push in these cases. To get to that sort of standardization, I think, honestly, we need a bit more in terms of that data standardization. So having multiple cases out there where you can examine and start teasing out what's different in different regimes, or for different in situ stresses, and start saying something where we can start getting to a little bit more prescriptive about what you can do for those mitigation strategies. So I see those two questions as kind of linked. The regulatory piece needs to be informed by good data, which needs good data standardization and good open sharing of data. So all these cases can be scrutinized. So then they can be done proactively instead of reactively.
Agree. And I mean, we have these cases of trailing seismicity, for example, at Schultz, Soufouret in France. This project was in a serious sort of jam publicly when that happened. And it took a lot of effort to sort of suss out what actually caused it. And so more cases like that are great, but meanwhile, we're not having that standardization. We're building our knowledge so that we can have it. So maybe there's a patient public sort of scenario that we need to think about too.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and emphasize something that Ryan was saying, which is really the standardization of data. So, at each of these different sites, there's probably a whole suite of different data that are collected, both, by by industry, by researchers. And in order to integrate all of those and look across these different different cases, we need the data really to be standardized. And there can be resistance to that because there is a lot of cost associated with standardization because, you might, a specific company or a researcher might have a way that they analyze data, the way they've collected the data. And so they've built all these tools on top of an assumed data type or data format. And so, those would need to be modified if the data format's changed. But I think we can probably all imagine that if we get to more standard data types, that we can then better and more easily then integrate them to do these types of hazard assessments for the different sites. And I don't think we'll ever get to the point where necessarily we'd have exact standard one-for-one transfer of, say, the number and locations of seismic stations that you need at a site. The geology is different, the subsurface is different, so you might need different setups for a particular location. But I think we could think generally about what the goals are for, say, seismic monitoring. Is it that we want to get down to magnitude 1s, magnitude 0s? What do we need to do to get that? So, yeah.
Let me add a couple of things. I'll start with the data itself. It is important that the data are of high quality. So that's a key parameter. You can go back and somehow, make the data good afterwards. It has to be controlled and checked from the beginning. Even if you start, hopefully, standardize the idea of recording background seismicity, the data have to be good. So low noise station close to the production well, all that information are important. If you need the good data because that's the best way to validate any model. That's something we have to keep in mind all the time. And certainly validation is important if you want to make decisions. Now moving to the site characterization and different geometries of station deployments or other type of data, that is certainly case by case. We have to, even if we have to go blind somehow and deploy an array, we have to change things in a way to see what is of our interest and how we can get to the low magnitude levels that we would like to investigate. Of course, it's important to get to the low level of microseismicity, that is below 1 or magnitude 1 or 0.5, just to see the trend from the fracking process that we expect. And then that will help us maybe understand if adjacent faults might be reactivated. That might be of higher risk. Now, moving to the traffic light protocols, that's although that has been nice, and I'm really supportive of this. I think it's important to keep in mind not only the magnitude as a level of as a threshold for the traffic light protocol, but also, as you said, the nuisance level that you mentioned earlier, and also maybe the ground motion, how the ground motion, the observed ground motion might affect the vibration, as Anne said earlier, might affect the infrastructure.
So, Alexandros, that's an excellent point and leads into the audience questions really well. So we're going to take the questions from the audience for the next 10 or 15 minutes. And we have some excellent questions, including that we have some new to geothermal members out in the audience, and they would like your perspective on the level of risk in geothermal. They're curious about some of these cases that you've alluded to that have shut down geothermal operations. How big were those earthquakes in particular? Where do you feel the public should really be concerned when it comes to risk level associated with earthquakes in the geothermal sector. Anne, what are your
Tough
thoughts?
and
I'm going to
open-ended
let Anne
question.
start. I know.
I'm looking around and saying, okay, who's going to take this hot potato? But it is, look, we have to be realistic, in my opinion. So Basel, I think it was about 3.6. Ryan will correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was shallow and it was noisy. So it was heard more than felt. And Basel is a very old city, with construction, methods that probably vary hugely across the city. But that, how do we say this? There are moves you can take in advance to be sure that you're not injecting into known faults that probably could have prevented that. So, but the reaction from the city was so strong that the project was shut down. And look, it might take quite a while to get over that. Recently in France, and also in the sort of Rhine Valley sort of setting, which Basel is kind of there as well. They had some earthquakes that I think were about maybe magnitude 2.7. I can't remember if it got up to 3 there. But again, the relatively shallow level of the events and the fact that they were felt by the population, which is a function partially of the shallowness, really annoyed people. And it's a very intractable problem, in my view, if we want to try to do these things. And Pohang is like way out there in the realm of should never have been even thought about. And people have tried to convince these folks not to do what they did in advance, and well, it didn't work. Okay, so maybe it's human nature. So maybe it's more about the operator and their experience, their knowledge of the subsurface and seismicity in general. Perhaps there's some kind of standardization there, but I'm going to turn it over to Ryan because I think he's probably wanting to say something.
I usually, this is kind of a tough question to ask or answer. How I might frame it is, first, a lot of what Anne had said is there's these extreme cases where, like Pohang, where there is the potential for serious risks. So damage, injury to people are things that can result from this. And if we're extending to just fracking, there's also cases where there's been loss of life over in China from these types of earthquakes. So that's one extreme that can happen. At the other end, though, there's the risks of just losing an operation entirely without having any of those type of risks manifest, right? And so that's part of why I think incorporating nuisance factors into this is important, because the worry or the concern around induced seismicity, or just the perception of risk, is, I would argue, nuisance drives that perception of risk, makes people worry about these things, and it makes them lobby to end operations. So if you can essentially do this a little bit more proactively and start thinking about what those tolerances to nuisance might be, and then never hit that tolerance, then we don't really have to answer this question about how worried should I be? Because then the public would essentially have this sort of trust that the operation is working as it's supposed to, and there's not going to be any risk because I'm not even going to feel this or be bothered by this. So that's, I guess, some of my thoughts on that, but I'm open it up to anyone else.
And generally speaking, seismicity is not a problem in geothermal projects. There's a few cases where it is. And I think the bulk of them do not have this problem. So I think for people who are new to geothermal, they should understand that there's, I hate to use the lone wolf kind of scenario here, but there are a few projects where, bad decisions were made. And that's something I think we have to acknowledge and learn from. Doesn't mean all geothermal is condemned. by
Yeah,
any means.
actually, I might tack on one thing to that is the Canadian perspective for like the frac-induced seismicity for petroleum fracking. It's less than 1% of the wells actually cause the earthquakes. It's just that there's enough wells that this ends up being a problem. So sorry.
So we have oh, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I would say to add on to that, you know, I think we have seen and we have experience with geothermal sites that have regular seismicity going back decades. So for example, in California, we have the Salton Sea geothermal, COSO, geysers. These are all places that have populations nearby. They're also places that regularly have small sized earthquakes that people feel. And, you know,
and
I
large
think,
ones too.
And sometimes somewhat larger ones. And so I think, you know, I don't think that we can necessarily say, you know, we're going to have our geothermal operation and you will never feel an earthquake. I think that's a sure way to make sure that your operation gets shut down. I think we need to communicate what has happened in the past at other geothermal energy sites and have clearly communicated what the mitigation plans are and what is being done over the life of that project to monitor, you know, what's happening in the subsurface and to say, well, if these things happen, this is what our plan is to address those. And I will say that I am of the mind that we do also need to acknowledge that we can never be 100% certain that we're not going to trigger something that's potentially damaging. We just simply don't know enough about the subsurface to know that there is no fault that you could potentially trigger. So I think that also speaks to kind of where we think about siting our geothermal plans. You know, your level of seismicity that's acceptable is much lower if you've sited a plant right above a city, for example, right in the middle of a city. And we've seen that, for example, with Basel and other operations that have really had to scale back with any seismicity. So I think that's what we need to keep in mind, and really that piece of communication with the people who live in those communities.
No,
From
you
my
go.
side, a couple of things to add is, first of all, for areas that we don't have it's not part of an urban environment, then I would say that any type of engineering risk in that case somehow it should be calculated, incorporated. The observed data will help you understand what is happening. If there are any other risks related to the environment or to the investment. If you go to an urban environment now, things are different. And I have to add that the social impact to the community that had never felt an earthquake before, suddenly feeling a 1.5 below their houses, it is really very high. And that is not easy to avoid. Their how they react to that. I mean, earthquakes, as we all know, because all of us, we have been involved in these projects. You know, the first time you feel them, you really feel like the earth is getting outside from below your observation point. You don't have a way to stand up in some cases. So that's how people feel. It's not like a flooding case where they see the water coming for a long time. It's just happening, and then that's it. And there are a lot of cases, as we know from high magnitude earthquakes, that there have been the people haven't been able even to sleep for a long time because of the big event and the aftershocks. So this is what people think about, and that's what people know. And I think it's important to communicate proactively what might happen. And as soon as they happen, what is our mitigation plan? What is our strategies, and all those things that can help to minimize the resilience times for the community to get back to everyday life.
Those are excellent points. It is true, based on our experiences in Texas, once a population becomes sensitized to how an earthquake will hear or be felt in their area, they will report to much lower magnitudes than one might expect or one might have been taught in their introduction earth sciences class. I'd like to get to one more audience question before we close up this panel. And I'm just going to read this one as it came in. Is it true that most incidences of induced seismicity have occurred in traditional hydrothermal projects where faults and fractures are more likely present? And if that's true, how do new hot, dry rock concepts in sedimentary basins compare in terms of risk profile? So this gets to relative risk in different types of geothermal operations. Would anybody like to speak to that question?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly and say that I think if you set out sensitive enough instruments to measure very low magnitude events, you'd probably find that they occur in many more geothermal systems that we know. But these are events that are maybe 1-0 lower sort of events because they're responding to changes in, say, production and ejections that are slightly being altered by the operator for whatever reason. So the question, I think, is being translated to let's say to the Texas environment or to the sedimentary basin environment. And that is one that I'm not as familiar with. So I think I'll let that answer go to someone else.
Okay, I'll take this one just to provide some insights. Comparing geothermal projects in sedimentary basins to cases with hard rock, we expect that in the sedimentary basins you wouldn't see induced seismicity because there have been areas where people have been fracking and we don't see so much induced seismicity. There are areas that we see, though, however, so you have to be careful. But due to the material itself, so the sedimentary formations that are not so brittle, maybe like they're more plastic compared to the hot rock, maybe that will be one of the reasons that you won't see induced seismicity that correspond more to high-length faults zones.
Well, we're nearing the end of our discussion, so I'm going to allow each of the panelists to make a short closing remark. Ryan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, so thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. I'm happy to do this. I think this is a worthy cause to talk about. I think one of the important takeaways from something like this is for geothermal to be able to learn from the prior induced seismicity that's happened from the oil and gas industry. And use some of the learnings from that and translate as much as possible these things over so these problems can be dealt with more proactively. Typically, what I've seen for the oil and gas experience is that a lot of what happens is a reaction to the earthquakes, even in terms of like at the most basic monitoring, where we don't come in with a baseline because this wasn't anticipated to be a problem. I think geothermal has a lot of additional learnings and knowledge that they can leverage. So if this ends up going into sedimentary basins or any other settings, we can learn from that and use that and adapt it.
Well, we were glad that you were able to join us today. Alexandros.
I think to be proactive is a key parameter. High quality data. It's important, and I think monitoring is a very low cost. It's a very low cost compared to the cost of the whole project. So I think it shouldn't be avoided. It should be really helpful and protect somehow the project.
Great. Anne?
Well, I'll just say that transparency with the public is critically important. I don't think we should sweep anything under the rug. I think we should say in EGS, we're developing a new type of energy that has the potential to literally save our planet. And there might be some risks associated with that. I don't think induced seismicity of the level that has been so sensationalized in the press is what we will experience. And therefore, I think we need to be talking to the public about this very openly, as we did when we were working on the Fallon EGS project, a runner-up to the Utah Forge project, and spoke to over 500 people about this. And we're very transparent and said, look, this is what we're going to do. There might be some induced seismicity. What do you think? Now, this is an area that's tectonically active, like some of those major fields we talked about earlier. Not as much as perhaps the San Andreas, but that's my position, is that we should educate, be open, and convince the public that this energy is worth producing.
Excellent. Thank you. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for a really stimulating, pun intended, conversation today. And I don't have anything additional to add to what my fellow panelists closed out with. So just thank you.
Well, I would like to thank the audience for their participation and take one more opportunity to thank our panelists. I think we're all very excited about geothermal, and I hope that our audience enjoys the rest of the Pivot 2022 program. Thank you.